Jesus is. Everybody ought to know. 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 Everybody ought to know who Jesus is. Who Jesus is. He is Lord. He is Lord. He is.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?